Okay, so as I'm hearing, the Wi-Fi seems to be in bad shape. So what I'm going to do is just record the meeting. And then if people just can't be here, that's fine. But I'll appreciate if you try to be here. For anyone who's here, I appreciate that. And obviously, your party, if you try to be here, then I'll try to count that as participation. But I understand that the Wi-Fi is not great at the moment. So, okay, so this should be helpful in any case, because some of these arguments are going to be ones that you're going to be asked during the final exam how they work. And last time we were looking at how Rawls's theory of justice works in broad outline, right? So the general idea again is the thought experiment of the original position. So in the original position, everyone ignores everything about some of their basic so it's, yeah. So everyone ignores what are their different talents, genders, races, wealth, and position in society, their status. These are things that are unknown to people in the original position. So again, this is a thought experiment, it's a hypothetical. And even though in real, something which I mentioned, which is even though in the real world, people have different conceptions of the good, in the thought experiment, in the hypothetical situation, people forget about like their different conceptions of the good, what they want from life, what sort of religious or non-religious beliefs they have, the sort of person they want to be, the sort of, political ideas they believe in. All of those things are forgotten. So again, that's something that we covered last time, but it's, since this is going to be up on the Moodle, I might as well mention it. However, even though people, forget all of these, markers of position and, the wealth, status, gender, race, and so on, all of those things, and even though they forget like their thick conceptions of the good, they do have a couple of things, right? So they have minimal rationality. They are capable of basic reasonings and basic calculation. And they also have a thin conception of the good, which means that they have a desire for self-realization in that society, right? And whatever is required by that desire, right? So even though they are not clear on who exactly they are and who they aspire to be and what they believe and what makes them happy, even though they don't know that, they still, people in the original position behind the veil of ignorance still want to realize themselves or find some way of realizing themselves. So that's going to be the thin conception of the good. Okay. So again, this is again the original position. Everyone is in that position, ignoring all of these basic things, but still having basic rationality and a thin conception of the good, right? So again, this is a thought experiment. It's a hypothetical, and the idea is that from that original position, people will choose the principles of justice, and that whatever principles they choose from that position will be, because they are fair, will be the true principles of justice. So that's the general idea. Okay. Okay. So how's the Wi-Fi working so far at the moment? Still bad? Okay. So, yeah, totally. I get it. That's why I'm recording the class. So it should be up in the Moodle, be helpful in that way. So, so when you're thinking about what the original position is and what the setup is, then you have to consider also the conditions under which the hypothetical agreement is bound to take place, which I'm going to mention in a second. What the specific argument for is, what's the specific argument or arguments that Rawls gives for the principles of justice from the original position. And the third thing will be the argument that if these principles are indeed so chosen, then they are the correct principles of justice, right? So the argument for this claim here that if these principles are chosen, then they are the correct principles of justice, has to do with the basic intuition that justice is just fairness, right? So, and fairness is starting from a position of symmetry between all the people who are going to choose the principles of justice, right? So because it is a fair position where everyone is equally ignorant and everyone has an equal capacity for rationality, for this idea of just logical reasoning, and an equal capacity for aspiring to realize themselves, which is the thin conception of the good. So all the people in the original position are equal in these respects. So it's fair, right? So it's no one is in any advantage with respect to any other. No one knows more about the situation than any other person, and so on, right? So when they make a choice for the correct principles of justice, they are making it from a situation of fairness, where everyone is in the same situation, right? So that's the argument for the claim that those principles are the correct principles of justice, that only the original position, where people forget all about who they are, their wealth, their race, their gender, their position in society, their status, and so on, but still, retain basic rationality and a thin desire and a thin conception of the good. Only from that thought experiment, thinks Rawls, because of its fundamental fairness, can people select the correct principles of justice, right? So that's the argument for claim 3. Okay, so what's the argument? So we haven't discussed some of the conditions under which the hypothetical agreement is meant to take place, right? So let me mention some of those. Okay, so, and this is, again, important. So we are using 3 guides at the moment for the discussion on Rawls. These are all in the course guides folder. So Intro to Rawls's Political Philosophy. There's also Intro to Rawls's Principles of Justice, and A Theory of Justice 1, Methodological Issues, right? So you are going to be able to find all of the assumptions in the setup for the original position in these guides. So if you are asked to reconstruct the argument for the original position, either in your paper or in the final exam, then you have to look at what these guides explain with regard to some of the basic assumptions of the thought experiment, right? So, for example, suppose that you are asked to explain how Rawls arrives at the difference principle, one of the principles of justice, principle 2b. Then the first thing you have to do is to explain the original position as a basic assumption. And what are the basic assumptions that in turn underlie the original position? And then from the original position, you have to explain the reasoning from that to the difference principle, right? So again, the original position is a thought experiment, but let's go a little bit deeper into what the idea of a thought experiment is, right? So the basic idea here is that a thought experiment is an idealized model, right? So an idealized model is just an abstract situation that we can think about, describe, imagine, in which we take away, it's abstract because we take away everything which is irrelevant for the sake of considering our specific problem, right? So that's sort of like what it means to idealize, to have an idealization, an idealized model of a situation, right? So to give an example, so when physicists, for example, are thinking about motion, they just think about particles and just a single particle in space and time and just basic equations, right? they are not going to consider the motion of every specific particle in every object, because that's just too complicated for the type of models that they want to build. And the same happens in economics, for example, right? So when economists are thinking about how to understand preferences and economic theory, part of what they do is just think about a single consumer, for example, right? And how they are going to rank their economic preferences, or they are going to think about a single product, like coffee, for example, right? The price and quantity of coffee. And so all the models are idealized models that consider just simplified situations. So the fact that the model is not realistic, in those cases, in physics, in economics, in other sciences, doesn't mean that the model doesn't have applications. I mean, obviously, like physics is a very successful science, for example, right? And most sciences work with idealized models. Again, an idealized model, again, is just an abstraction from a concrete situation that takes away everything irrelevant to reason about that situation. So obviously, we are never going to find ourselves in the original position. We can never forget who we are, what's our race, what's our gender, what's our position in society, what's our nationality, and so on. We can never remove those things. So it's not about, it's not, the point is not that the model is realistic. The point is that it's useful to get rid of everything which is irrelevant to considerations of justice. That's how Rawls is thinking about the matter, right? So, and what he's thinking is, look, all of these things really obscure the matter of justice, because once you know who you are biased to argue for certain things. So when you remove everything which is, which biases you towards those things, then you are in a position of fairness, where you are better able to reason about what will be, what society should be like in order for everyone to be able to live their best life in it, right? So that's the general idea. Rawls wants an idealization that removes everything which is irrelevant to the situation, which might bias people because of they already know what their position in society is like, so that within that abstract situation, we can reason about what the ideal society will be like. So that's what it means to talk about an idealized model, okay? So this is, again, in the guide on Rawls, chapter 1. So that's one of the assumptions or premises of the original position, that it is an idealized model, okay? Assumption 1, idealized model. Now, here are some constraints. By the way, I know that people are having a hard time being online because of the Wi-Fi. So again, if you leave your name in the chat, I'll save the chat as a gesture of appreciation for trying to be here with the Wi-Fi issues. So please do that. Please try to write your names in the chat. Okay. Okay, so carrying on, I'm recording this again, as I mentioned, so that people can use it for their final exam and their final paper. So one of the assumptions, it's an idealized model. Another assumption, minimal rationality. I already explained this a little bit last time, but the general idea is that people in the original position, behind the veil of ignorance, where they have forgotten everything, are still capable of basic reasoning, right? So that means that rational agents reason logically. Their preferences are transitively ordered. So again, like a transitive order for preferences just means that if I prefer A to B, and if I prefer B to C, then I prefer A to C. Okay, so they have preferences which are ordered. They can reason logically, and they will choose outcomes which are advantageous to them, right? Give them, some sort of possibility. So in this case, what does advantageous mean, since they ignore everything about their position? It means that it enhances the possibility for self-realization. So remember, there are some things that the world should be like should have some characteristics in order for people to be fully realized. So for example, suppose that I'm completely bounded and chained. Like it's not possible for me to be fully realized if I am completely bounded and chained, for example, right? Or if I cannot, I'm not allowed to think for myself, or I'm not allowed, to try and find out what might make me happy. So if I cannot do any of those things, then clearly my possibilities for happiness are constrained, right? So part of minimal rationality means that we are going to, even though we don't know exactly how, we don't have a thick conception of the good. We don't know what sort of persons we are and what sorts of persons we want to be, and our traits and so on. Even though we do not know that, we do know that we want to find to realize ourselves in society. So, and just that fact, the fact that we want to realize ourselves, means that we need some basic freedom, some basic and so on, right? So minimal rationality does require that people can reason logically, that they can that they have preferences for things that will help them realize themselves, regardless of who they are. It doesn't matter who they end up being in the world, right? It doesn't matter what your race is, what your creed is, what your nationality is. Everyone needs some basic stuff in order to be able to realize themselves. So that's what it means that rationality requires that one looks for advantageous commitments. Again, this is, so that's another assumption of the original position, right? So assumptions or premises, it's in the original position, it's an idealized model. You have minimal rationality, and you also have a thin conception of the good, which I already explained earlier. Okay, so a thin conception of the good just means that even though people might disagree about what sort of projects they pursue in life and what they regard as important, again, what sort of persons they want to be in a deep sense. So, for example, I decided that I wanted to be a philosopher, right? You have decided that you're interested in, political science, communication, psychology, sports, economics, finance, whatever, right? So different people have different projects. That's part of the thick conception of the good. But we all, in the original position, we still have all a thin conception of the good, right? So we are going to want everything that's required for self-realization, such as certain liberties, just a certain basic type of the possibility of having some sort of income in order not to starve and so on, right? So those things are necessary conditions in order for self-realization. That's what it means to have a thin conception of the good. That's another assumption of the original position. And another one is the assumption of the circumstances of justice. Okay, so what does this mean? This means that the situation that Rawls is thinking about is not a situation, for example, of extreme war or a situation of extreme abundance, material abundance, right? So really questions about justice, like the deepest questions about justice, just come into play when people are noting those two extreme cases, right? So in the case of war and extreme deprivation, obviously, like the first thing is just to fix that situation, not die either from violence or hunger and so on. So in a situation of extreme extreme conditions such as war or starvation and so on, that's not really like the situation that Rawls is considering for the thought experiment, right? Because other things come into play in that case. And the same goes for like a situation of extreme abundance. Like in a situation of extreme abundance, where people have, so suppose that in the future, for example, we have machines that could produce everything we want materially, right? So in that case, the question of justice really is not as important as, I mean, it doesn't disappear, right? It's not as in a society where we have a scarcity of resources and we have to distribute them in the best possible manner, right? So, so that's going to be the circumstances of justice. In the situation in which the thought experiment holds is just a situation where there's not extreme scarcity on the one hand, but also not extreme abundance, right? So there are resources and they have to be distributed, right? So it is a problem of distributive justice, right? So in those circumstances is where you apply the original position. Another assumption here that Rawls is dealing with is the assumption of the basic structure. So what's the idea here? The idea is that that Rawls is not going to really think about the international stage. He's just going to think about a single society and the duties in that society, that the duties that society has to its citizens. So that's really the situation where he's trying to apply the original position. Again, because the international stage is very different. If you think about it, like the international stage is sort of like in a state of nature type of situation. There's no government. There are a number of agents and a number of agreements and a number of alliances that sort of keeps certain stability, but it's very unstable in comparison to like a country that has governance and principles of law and well-established security and so on, right? So Rawls just doesn't want to add those complications. So he's just thinking of a basic structure in society. Just just a simple country or nation instead of like a society connected to, instead of a country within a League of Nations, for example, right? So a simple country, a simple nation, no international elements, for the sake of finding out what are the principles of justice. So in that sense, it's an idealization that has a lot of constraints, right? So Rawls is telling us these are the cases, the cases that I want to consider hold only when these constraints hold. So those are assumptions of the original position, okay? Any thoughts or questions? Okay, so let me mention a little bit about this notion of this notion of the main principles of justice that Rawls is discussing, right? And then there are some complications which I think I will just not mention during this video because they just seem like something that we should try, and because it's a little bit more complicated, we should try to address it in person next week. So so I want to just give you very quickly something that can be very useful for the exam, since I'm going to upload this recording anyway, which is how do the arguments for the three main principles go? And we might review some of these again next week, but hopefully this should cover like the basic ideas, right? So again, there are three principles of justice, right? So again, the idea is that from the original position, with the veil of ignorance, Rawls argues that people will choose these three principles here. Everyone will choose them by unanimity, right? So it's a choice, and it's a choice that everyone will agree on. And the principles are these. The first principle, the liberty principle, is just, this is a direct quote. that each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive total system of equal liberties compatible with a similar system of liberty for all. That's the first principle. The second principle is divided in two parts. So, and they have to do with the social and economic inequalities in society, right? So the social and economic inequalities in society are to be arranged so that they are both to the greatest benefit of the least advantage, which is the difference principle, and attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. And I already talked a little bit about this last time. But so principle 1 is called the liberty principle. Principle 2b is the fairness opportunity principle. I think last time I mentioned 2b is the difference principle. That was my mistake. 2a is the difference principle, and 2b is the fairness of opportunity principle, and 2a is the difference principle. So first, the liberty principle, 2b, fairness of opportunity principle, and 2a, the difference principle. And then the idea is that in the original position behind the veil of ignorance, people are going to reason to a social contract that sort of arrives at those three principles as a sort of like philosophical constitution from which the specific laws of the state should be derived. Or should, at least they should guide the specific construction of more specific laws within the state. So those will be the three principles that will tell you what the state needs to do in order to be just. And then the rest will be a matter of application, okay? So the argument for the liberty principle, I already talked about it a little bit last time, is that that since, again, and some of the assumptions that I just mentioned come into play. So for example, the assumption of the base of the circumstances of justice, right? So in the circumstances of justice, to repeat, are the circumstances where a society is not in extreme either in extreme scarcity or in extreme abundance. So it's in the middle of those two things, right? So there are resources and they have to be distributed. So it's a problem of, so there's distributive justice at play, right? So within the circumstances of justice, since people are not in a position of extreme scarcity in the original position, and they know this, they know that they are not in a position of extreme scarcity. That's one of the things that they do know, because it's one of the assumptions, again, of the original position. Then they will not want in that situation to curtail any liberties, right? Because they have already reached a level of well-being, at least in terms of scarcity, right? So there are sufficient resources to feed the population and so on if they are administered well, right? So in that situation, people will choose principles of liberty. And the argument for that, again, is very simple. It's just an argument from the assumption of the thin conception of the good, right? So from the thin conception of the good and from the circumstances of justice assumptions, people will, in the original position, will think that they want to realize themselves. And in order for them to realize themselves, they are going to need basic liberties. Liberties of movement, liberty of speech, liberty of thought, liberty of creed, and so on, right? Because otherwise, how will people be able to figure out the thick conception of the good, what they want from life, what their religious beliefs are, what sort of persons they want to be, what sorts of persons they want to know, what sort of profession they want to devote themselves to, what city or what part of their society they want to live in, and so on, right? So all of those things require liberty of movement, liberty of thought, liberty of creed, a number of liberties. So those are the basic liberties, right? So from the fact that people desire to self-realize, which is the thin conception of the good in the original position, then in order to actually have this self-realization, which will be a full conception of the good, they need these basic liberties. So it's a requirement for self-realization in the original position. Therefore, it's a just principle that everyone will choose, because everyone needs all these liberties in order to realize themselves. So it's unanimously chosen by everyone in the original position. So first argument for the first principle. So, and that's how Rawls tries to show that you can therefore prove that principle from the original position, given his other assumptions. Okay. So that explains. So, for example, if you are asked in the exam, or if you are working on your paper and you're asked to reconstruct the argument, that's the general idea, right? So, it's the argument the conclusion of the argument is just the liberty principle. That's the conclusion of the argument. And the premises of the argument are the original position.
And then Liza, it goes OMG equals.
Okay, so I don't know what that was, but so again, the conclusion of the argument for thinking about the argument for the liberty principle, the conclusion of that argument is again the liberty principle, the first one, and the premises or assumptions are going to be the original position, and within the original position, the notion of the thin conception of the good, the circumstances of justice, and the basic rationality assumption. And then you just have to show how, from all of those, it's a requirement for self-realization that people have basic liberties. So everyone will choose the liberty principle. So it's proven by this argument from those assumptions, according to Rawls. Now, with regards to the argument that for 2B, I don't know if I have like a discussion of that here, but yeah. So I think that the basic idea is that you can show that 2B is also required for people in order to be able to realize themselves by a similar reasoning as the reasoning that you used. So this principle here, 2B, that will be the conclusion of the argument for the fairness of opportunity principle, right? So the fairness of opportunity principle is this one, 2B, and it will be a conclusion of an argument that also has as assumptions the original position, the thin conception of the good, and the idea of basic rationality. Because again, it says that attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. So it says that society, that people from the original position in the veil of ignorance will choose that their society has this, implements this principle too, that all offices and positions are open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. So again, as something that we discussed last time, this has to do with the possibility of employment and political positions as well, right? So what 2B is saying here is that everyone will choose that in that society, every person will be able to hold any job, regardless of their race, gender, social status, wealth, their origin, and so on, right? So, and that seems, again, the argument seems very intuitive, right? If you are in the original position and you don't know anything about where you're going to end up, who you are, what your nationality, what your origin, like ethnic origin is, your race or your gender, or your wealth, or your talents, and so on. If you don't know any of that, then you will want a society that, regardless of where you show up in society, would allow you to have any employment as long as you're qualified, right? So you won't be discriminated against for any of those characteristics, right? So, and again, this means, of course, employment, like in any sector. So not, but also political employment, political office. So you could be a senator, you could be a president, you could be, regardless of any of these characteristics, right? So the idea will be, the argument will be that it will be irrational for you in the original position from the veil of ignorance to not have this principle, because if you do not have this principle, then it could be the case that you are discriminated against and you might not be able to have some job or some political office, right? So that's against the idea of basic rationality from the original position, where you're not going to know who you are, right? So from that argument and those assumptions, again, the original position and the idea of basic rationality and the idea that you want to realize yourself, you can conclude that it will be against your self-interest to not have fairness of opportunity. Therefore, 2A is proved, which is the fairness of opportunity principle, right? So again, we have already gone through the argument for the liberty principle from the premises. It's a deductive argument, and we have already gone as well through the argument for the fairness of opportunity principle from the premises. It's again a deductive argument. So we only have one argument left. So far, it seems that Rawls at least has some strong arguments for his principles. And the idea again is to prove, these principles as conclusions of deductive arguments. So there are premises and there's a valid logical reasoning, or at least that's the intention. That's the intent of Rawls, okay? So let's look at the last principle here. And I think that should be, like, if I were to upload a video on like the content for the final exam, I think that the stuff that I'm mentioning right now in this video should be the most useful for the purposes of your paper and the final exam, right? So we have already seen the argument for the liberty principle and for the fairness of opportunity principle. So the argument for one, the liberty principle, and the argument for 2A, the fairness of opportunity principle. So what's the argument for, and the argument for 2B, the fairness of opportunity principle? What's the argument for 2A? 2A is the difference principle, okay? Again, I've been mixing them up, but you can see here that this is the one from the fairness of opportunity principle is offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity, and A is the difference principle, to the greatest benefit of the least advantage. So we have to find out what the argument for 2A is. That's the one we are missing. Okay, this is from all the three arguments, this is the most difficult one. So the idea here is that this is, again, as I explained last time, this is a conditional principle. Okay, so a conditional principle is a principle of the form if then, right? If P then Q. So where P is the condition, right? So for example, if I tell you you have to answer all the questions in the final, or you won't get full credit, then a condition for getting full credit on the final is to answer all the questions, right? So that's just what a conditional claim looks like. A claim of the form if P then Q, okay? And where if then is a logical connective, again, right? So what the difference principle says, in essence, is very simple. It says, if there are to be inequalities in society, these inequalities should work for the benefit of the worse off. Again, the difference principle. What does it say? It says, if there are to be inequalities in society, then these have to work for the benefit of the worse off. So the difference principle does not say that there should be inequalities in a just society. It doesn't say that. It only says that, suppose that the best society that the people in the veil of ignorance in the original position can aspire to is one that has some inequalities. Then those inequalities should work for the benefit of the worse off. Okay. that's what it says here. If this is true, then we ought to accept in it. So, and the idea here is that I mentioned it here, that there might be reasons why we might require inequalities in society in order for society to be better than the alternative, which is completely where there are no inequalities at all, right? And this have to do with empirical factors. So that's why Rawls cannot determine from just the thought experiment whether the difference principle will require inequalities or not, because it really depends on what sorts of persons we are, what sort of beings we are, right? So part of the idea here is that there might be like psychological reasons to motivate, that people might need some motivation in order to do better, to do the best for society, for example, right? So for example, suppose that you want to be very successful in order to be valued by others, or to have a nice house, or just, just live a comfortable life. And if you could not do that, you will put less effort into things. Like if you could not get more recognition than others, if you could not get more perks than others for your hard work, you might not put so much effort into things. So that's, again, just consider that. I'm not saying that's true, but part of the idea here is that if that were true, like if it's true of most people, that most people will not do their best, they won't be as productive if there are no incentives for them to, like for self-interest, if there are no reasons for them to put some, if there are no economic incentives, like, like more money or better material conditions, and people will not be motivated to be more productive because of that, then society will be worse, even for the worse off. Like imagine a society that's where no one is productive at all. Like maybe everyone is equal, but maybe everyone lives in a very bad situation of almost starvation, for example, right? Not quite a starvation, but almost. Imagine that that's the case. So that's what Rawls is saying. He's not saying we should have an unequal society. All he's saying is, if people are not motivated just by pure altruism, and they need economic motivation in order for, to do their best to produce more, then we should allow inequality, but only if that inequality is for the benefit of the worse off. That means that you will have a welfare state on this view, where the floor, the quality of life for the people, for the worse off, will be greatly, will be improved, right? So they will have as much as society can give them, given that they are the worst off, like maybe food, healthcare, basic, some basic income, like whatever, like as much as society can afford to give them and not go bankrupt, it should give to them. So that's the idea, that economic inequalities will only be tolerated, or will only be not tolerated, will only be just if they work for the benefit of the worse off. Okay, so that's the idea of the difference principle. And that's why it is a conditional claim. So far, I'm only explaining the difference principle. I'm not giving the argument, because I haven't given the argument for the principle. I have just explained what it says, because it's complicated to understand what it says, right? Some of these ideas came out also during our discussion of arguments for and against free markets, when we were talking about Hayek's argument, the knowledge argument, the idea that markets are good for determining demand better than, for example, the state will be. And the idea there was that the price mechanism, locally, the fact that people can observe that other people want stuff, food or other stuff, and therefore are motivated to produce that or sell that in order to make a profit. That's the price mechanism, and it and the idea of Hayek is that tends to guarantee that there's not going to be a scarcity of economic goods, right? So again, that's an argument that might that's an argument that Hayek gives, but it might be true, it might be false, it might hold only in some cases. But the point here is that that's like an empirical view. Again, like the view of that we need like incentives to do our best. So what Rawls is saying is, suppose people really are like that. Suppose people are not that altruistic and they really need these economic incentives. Then in that case, we should allow inequality, but only if it's for the benefit of the worse off. So people should not get confused by the fact that Rawls is saying that perhaps we should allow inequality and think that he's like some sort of like right-winger philosopher or something like that. No, not at all. All he's saying is maybe the idea will be for there to be equality, but if that's not possible because people don't have the, will not feel as motivated to be as productive, if people need economic incentives for society to be as best as possible, so that even the worse off will be better than in a society that doesn't have these inequalities, then those inequalities should work for the benefit of the worse off. Again, I know I'm repeating myself a lot, but it's very important that you understand what the principle says, and when you explain it in your final or in your paper, that it's clear that you actually get what it says, right? So that's why I'm repeating myself so much. Okay, so what's going to be the argument for the difference principle? I have all I've said so far is just explain what it says, because it's a conditional claim and the condition is very unclear. So that's what the principle says, that if there are to be inequalities, they should work for the benefit of the worse off. Economic inequalities. So the argument here is, again, from the original position, which is an assumption, and given basic rationality and given a thin conception of the good, people will want to realize themselves, right? And they will want to make sure that they are in the best position possible. So, but imagine imagine that you end up in the position of the worse off. And imagine that you don't live in a society that's Rawlsian. So it could be the case that, for example, you have no access to food, even if you're starving. It could be the case that if you're among the worse off, then you have no access to healthcare. It could be the case that you have no access to basic dignity and so on. Like even, that certainly happens even in like developed countries like the US, that sometimes people lack access to these things, right? And the idea here is that if you are rational, then in the veil of ignorance, in the original position from the veil of ignorance, given that you don't know where you're going to end up in society, then you are going to want to defend the difference principle, because the risks that you end up among the worse off and that you cannot even, like that if society is not Rawlsian, that you might starve, that you might not have any access to healthcare, that you might have no access to like basic dignity and basic material possibilities, it's too much of a risk, right? So the idea here is that if you are rational, then you make calculated risks, as opposed to just make stupid, risky decisions, like throwing yourself off a cliff, for example, right? Like even people who like risk takers, I mean, unless they are very rational, try to take calculated risks, right? And so the idea here will be that Rawls is considering two principles for rationality. One is utility maximization, which is something we have considered, which is you always maximize utility, right? So it could be that, for example, you maximize expected utility. So So you don't know how much utility you might get from your position in society. But so, for example, suppose that if you're reasoning according to utility maximization, you might reason like this. You might think, okay, so I don't know where I'm going to end up, but suppose that I end up as in the middle class, or like well off, then my utility will be greater, right? And maybe it's not so likely that I will end up among the worse off. So it's more likely that I end up getting more utility if than that I will be getting less utility, because it's more likely that I will be middle class or high class, right? So for example, like suppose that the worse off are just like the small percentage of the population, right? So you reason like this. So if you reason according to utility maximization from the original position, then you might not accept the difference principle. You might say, yeah, it doesn't really, we shouldn't really help the worse off. We shouldn't really put the worse off first, because, or I won't vote for that principle because my expected utility will be greater if I'm middle class or high class, whatever, right? So I don't know where I'm going to end up in society, but supposing that I end up, but it's likely that I will end up not being among the worse off. So I should just put my, my eggs in that basket, because that will give me the greatest utility. So that's not the principle that Rawls accepts, right? So he rejects this principle, okay? To be sure, to be completely sure, he rejects utility maximization from the original position. He's not a utilitarian, okay? Again, I repeat, Rawls is not a utilitarian. And there's another, but still it's a principle of rationality. So Rawls has to give like a reason for why he doesn't want that principle. So he's going to accept this other principle, which is called maximin, right? So maximin just means maximize the minimum. So maximize the worst possible life outcome. So make the worst possible outcome as best as possible. That's what maximin means. Okay, make the worst possible outcome as good as possible. Make the worst possible outcome as good as possible, right? So so not to be green, but imagine that you are that you hurt yourself, right? So it will be far better if you like just have a scratch than if you like break your arm, for example, right? So if you had to choose between those two situations, you will choose the situation where you suffer less harm, right? So what Rawls is saying here is that that among all the principles of rationality in the original position, people in that position are going to choose maximin over utility maximization. Why? Because this is a principle of the risk averse. If you're averse to risk, you're going to choose maximin. And why would you be averse to risk in the original position? Because it's just one game. Like if you only have one shot of designing the most just a just society, if you only have one shot, and then it doesn't, like wherever you end up, then that's where you're going to end up. Then if you make the wrong choice about who to design society, you might end up in a terrible position. Again, imagine that you live in a society which is not Rawlsian, and you don't have any access to, like, if you're among the worst off, you might have lack access to healthcare, you might lack access to sanitation, you might lack access to basic food, you might be starving, you might lack access to basic justice, like justice, like security, right? So that's a possibility. Like if you don't choose the difference principle, that's a possibility, because it is the difference principle that has society look out for the worse off. That's the principle, right? So Ross is saying no one will want to risk that. If you're in the original position and you have to choose one principle, and you have to make a choice about how society is going to be, you're not going to risk being in the worst possible situation with no insurance, where you are screwed. If you're in that situation, you are screwed. In a Rawlsian society, well, yeah, you're going to be among the worst off, but you will still have basic chances, healthcare, food, security, and so on, access, to that stuff to be able to improve yourself and to realize yourself, right? And that's something that you want in the original position because of the thin conception of the good. So Rawls thinks, again, so these are the assumptions. The conclusion is the difference principle. The assumptions are the original position, the thin conception of the good, and maximin, right? And then Rawls argues that you're going to choose maximin in the original position with a thin conception of the good, given that it's only one game, and you will not want to take a stupid risk like that. The risk of being among the worse off and not being able to realize any of your potential or any of your happiness, right? So from the original position, from the thin conception of the good, you will choose maximin, maximize the minimum, make the worst outcome, improve the worst outcome as much as possible. And from that, it follows that you have to choose the difference principle, because the difference principle says that if you are among the worst, that if you're among the worst off, and societies, and there are economic inequalities, those inequalities are going to work in your favor. So again, that it's going to be a deductive argument for principle 2a, the difference principle, and then the conclusion of that argument is going to be that economic inequalities are, if society has to have economic inequalities, they should work for the benefit of the worse off. So that's going to be the conclusion of the argument, and the assumptions are going to be, the premises or assumptions are going to be the original position, the veil of ignorance, and the assumptions of those, and the maximin principle of rationality because of risk. Okay, so these are the three arguments. Those are the main assumptions of the arguments. That's the reconstruction of the argument, step by step, from the assumptions to the conclusion. So when you are asked how the arguments work, how to reconstruct the arguments, what are the assumptions, how the reasoning goes, all of that is in the guides and in this video. So you should pay attention to that. Okay, so I'm going to stop recording, but if there are any questions, if anyone is around, I don't know if the Wi-Fi got fixed or not, but next time we'll see each other in class as usual. Okay, so yeah, so I'm going to upload this to the movie. Okay.